Hey everyone, it's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and in today's opening video we're going to be talking about the Four Knights game. The Four Knights game is a King's Pawn opening. White's going to begin the game with e4, and Black responds with e5, and just like the name says, all these knights are going to take their most active post here in the center. White can play knight to f3 attacking that pawn, Black defends it with knight c6, and here White simply chooses to play knight to c3, and Black plays knight to f6. This is usually not considered as ambitious by White as some of White's more popular choices here, like the Ruy Lopez with bishop b5, or the Italian with bishop c4, but there's certainly nothing wrong with it. You do end up with this symmetrical position here, and you can actually arrive here from many different move orders. For example, after e4, e5, knight f3, if Black plays the Petrov defense here with knight to f6, White usually takes here on e5 or plays d4. Those are some main lines of the Petrov, but White can avoid all that and go into the Four Knights game. After knight c3, Black will probably play knight to c6, and you end up right back in the Four Knights. Just one more example, even in the Alekhine defense with e4 knight f6, White will usually advance this pawn with e5 to kick that knight away, but if White is not up for that challenge, White can simply defend this pawn. Black will sometimes here play e5, and you can end up right back in a Four Knights game after knight f3, knight c6. White has two main moves here, which are bishop to b5, this is the Spanish variation, or White can play d4, putting some pressure on the Black center, and this is called the Scotch variation. We'll come back at the end of the video and look at other possible moves by White, but for now we're going to focus on these two most popular moves. So let's go ahead and start here with the Scotch variation. Black will usually go ahead and make this exchange on d4, and then Black's most popular move by far is to play bishop b4, developing that bishop and pinning this knight. Other moves are playable but not as popular. Playing d6 seems to needlessly lock in this bishop. There's no real reason to do that. And bishop c5 looks like another logical developing move to get that bishop out and get ready to castle. But here White gets to develop with a threat. White can play bishop e3, and not only is White defending this knight and developing a piece, but this actually stops Black from castling for the time being, because after castles, knight takes c6 would win for White. There's a discovered attack here on the bishop, so Black cannot recapture the knight. And if Black throws in bishop takes e3, of course the queen is hanging, so Black ends up losing material. This means that Black might have to respond to this move by maybe exchanging here on d4, but White seems to be clearly better in this position. The queen can't be easily harassed here in the center, and White has a space advantage and a lead in development. So that's not what Black's looking for. Black will usually play bishop to b4. Black's possibly threatening to win this e4 pawn because of the pin. White would like to defend it with bishop d3, but then this knight would be loose. So White usually takes this opportunity to throw in knight takes c6, doubling the Black pawns. Black should recapture with the b pawn. You don't want to recapture with the d pawn here, because then after queen takes d8, Black's going to lose those castling rights. So b takes, and now bishop d3, calmly defending this pawn here in the center. Black will often play d5, trying to get rid of their doubled pawns and fighting White for some space in the center. After White makes this exchange on d5, White can castle. Black should definitely get their king to safety before White puts this rook on the e-file, so castling is by far Black's most popular move here. And now White develops their other bishop with bishop to g5. White's threatening to cause some trouble here for Black with possibly taking on f6, and if the queen were to capture, this d5 pawn would be loose, and taking with the g-pawn, of course, wrecks the pawns by the king, so Black will usually play c6 here to defend the d5 pawn, and now White plays queen to f3, adding some pressure here to the f6 knight. So when White goes for the Scotch version of the Four Knights, playing that move d4, this is by far the most popular way for the game to go. All these moves are very logical for both sides. Both players do have some alternatives, but they're not too popular. For example, here after bishop g5, Black could try to prevent this threat by simply exchanging here on c3 and wrecking the White pawns, but now they're really going to miss this dark squared bishop. White's queen is still going to come to f3, and this bishop won't be available to drop back to e7 and break this pin like it is in the main line. After queen f3, this bishop does often come back to e7, just breaking this pin. And we are left with a pretty interesting position here. Black seems to have a space advantage for the time being, but Black's pawn structure is also a little less compact than White's. Black has an isolated a-pawn, and the infamous so-called hanging pawns here in the center, the c and d pawns with no pawns on the adjacent files. They're strong because they gain space, but they can also be turned into weaknesses if you're not careful. For example, if White ever moves this knight away and plays c4, White could possibly create an isolated pawn here in the center if white gets to exchange there. If black takes on c4, then the c6 pawn might be isolated. So those are kind of the pluses and minuses of having this space advantage from black's perspective. Of course, the open e file is also a big feature of this position. Both players will likely put a rook on that file in the near future. So we've looked at the Scotch variation with d4. Now let's take a look at the Spanish variation with bishop b5. This idea is known from the Ruy Lopez. White is kind of putting some positional pressure here on black. If black's not careful, white might eventually have the threat to exchange here on c6, and then this e5 pawn would be undefended. Black has an opportunity they do not have in the Ruy Lopez, though. They can actually turn around and do the same thing to white by playing bishop b4. It turns out that neither player is usually ready to make good on this threat. For example, if white did try to take on c6 here and then win a pawn, black could simply play queen to e7, and it's very hard to imagine white holding on to this extra pawn. This e4 pawn is very weak, the knight's under attack, and after, for example, f4, black could simply now exchange on c3 and take on e4 themselves. White certainly gets no advantage here. In fact, this might be slightly favorable for black, because the king is going to be a bit exposed now on the king side, so white will usually not go for something like this. Instead, back in this position, white usually simply castles, black can castle, and here white often just plays d3 and defends this pawn. Black can follow suit. We still have a completely symmetrical position, but now white gets to play bishop g5 and use that extra tempo to create a possible threat here. White's threatening to play knight to d5, and this move kind of forces black to break the symmetry. You might be wondering why black cannot just play bishop g4 and keep copying white, but it's not such a great idea now. Here white can play knight to d5, threatening to take this bishop here and also threatening to wreck the black king's shelter here by taking on f6, and if black copies white again and plays knight d4, now white can take the bishop, black is forced to take the bishop to get their piece back, white comes back to d5, black comes back to d4, now white can play this move queen to d2, and things can go very wrong here for black if black is not careful. White has a very good score from this position. For example, after knight takes f3, g takes f3, bishop takes f3, now white can take here with the bishop and play queen to e3, trying to swing their queen into an attack here on the king side, and this knight seems to be more valuable than the bishop. For example, one game continued bishop to h5, now queen to h6, bishop g6, and f4. White seems to have the more pleasant game here. Another funny game continued here from this position after queen d2, with black taking with the bishop here on f3, trying to preserve this strong knight. White still takes here on f6, and black still seems to be in trouble here. If black takes here on f6, white does not have to take here on f3. Queen h6 would once again be very strong. In one game, instead of taking here on f6, black played queen to d7, and we get this completely symmetrical position, but now black finally pays for it. White can play knight to e7 check, and after king h8, bishop takes g7 wins for white. King takes g7, queen g5, and black gets checkmated. Queen f6 mate. So, word of warning there, you usually can't play a symmetrical game forever, because eventually your opponent's extra tempo is going to come in handy. So after bishop g5, white's threatening to play this knight d5 move. Black usually goes ahead and exchanges off here on c3, gives up the bishop pair, and in exchange they wreck the white pawn structure a little bit for the time being. This knight here on c6 is kind of poorly placed for black, so black will often try to transfer it to the e6 square, where it can attack this bishop. Black's most popular move here is queen to e7, and white could exchange off for this knight if white wanted to, and then we get once again a very symmetrical pawn structure here, so white usually doesn't choose to do that. They want to keep that pair of bishops. And the main line continues rook to e1, knight d8, coming to e6. White takes the opportunity to play d4 here and expand in the center. And after knight to e6, trying to break this pin to the queen, white will here play bishop to c1. Very interesting move here. White is kind of keeping this bishop available to swing to this diagonal or to stay on this diagonal. The bishop kind of has the most scope here from this c1 square. Black has a few choices here. c5 is their most popular move, trying to fight for some more central space. White often chooses not to lock up the center by playing d5 because white has the two bishops here, and the pair of bishops love wide open positions. That's when they're a lot better than the bishop and knight. Funnily enough, white's most popular move here is just bishop f1, getting this bishop out of the way of any kind of threats that black could use against it, and this bishop doesn't really do anything on b5 anymore without this knight on c6, so white simply tucks it away on f1. So that's the main line of the Spanish variation of the four knights. Both players have several alternatives, of course. For example, instead of playing bishop b4 here, black will sometimes play knight to d4, just attacking this bishop. And this undefends the e5 pawn for now, but black sometimes plays this with the idea of sacrificing a pawn. One continuation here is after bishop a4. Sometimes black will just continue to develop with bishop c5 and not defend this pawn for the time being. And if white accepts the gambit and takes that pawn, black will just castle. The center got opened up here, so black's hoping they can capitalize on that with their lead in development. And white can play knight d3 here and move that knight out of the way and attack this bishop. White has kind of an awkward development here with a knight blocking in their d-pawn, but at the same time white is up a pawn. Not the most popular way for black to play. It's unclear if they really have enough compensation for a pawn. It's just one example of an alternative to the main line with bishop b4. Alright, we've covered the two main lines, the Scotch variation with d4 and the Spanish with bishop b5. Let's take a look at just a couple other options white has here. Bishop c4 looks like a very normal developing move, but it's actually not too popular here. This allows black to do the famous center fork trick, where black can actually take this pawn now on e4, and if white takes that knight, black will play d5 and fork the bishop and knight. White's not going to lose any material. They're currently up a piece for a pawn, black's going to win a piece back for a pawn, and the material's equal, but black does have the lone pawn in the center, and most players with white don't want to go for this. So that's the main reason bishop c4 is not seen too often. White also sometimes fianchettos this bishop with a move like g3. It's not the most popular option though because this bishop already has a perfectly good line of development here. Why spend a move trying to create another one, especially to create a diagonal that's kind of blocked off by this pawn on e4. So black has many fine options here. Sometimes black will play d5, sometimes black will play bishop b4, kind of analogous to white's two most popular moves in the previous position. And this position is considered to be roughly equal. White certainly gets no advantage here, but some players just like this setup with the fianchettoed bishop, so it's just good to keep that option in mind. There's various other setups too. For example, bishop e2 is playable, I suppose, but it seems like a very passive square for that bishop compared to putting it on b5. So most of these options aren't really considered too much. There's not much independent value here. They just seem to be worse versions of the two most popular lines. One variation I do want to mention in particular, though, is the ridiculous-looking sacrifice knight takes e5, the famous Halloween gambit. It's definitely not an objectively good sacrifice by any means. White's giving up a whole piece here for only a pawn, but white's hoping they'll get a big space advantage here in the center and can kick around those black knights. For example, knight g6 and possibly e5, and these knights are kind of in retreat mode, but it's definitely not worth a piece, objectively speaking. Thank you for watching, everyone. And make sure you go visit chesspathways.com. Type it in right now and get signed up. It only takes a couple seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join. Don't miss out on all of our exclusive content, the contests that our community holds. Make sure you get signed up at chesspathways.com. Thanks, and I'll see you there.